The small boats have not surprisingly been cited as one of the main concerns among voters. And it's understandable because this is a situation that seems to be out of control, really. It seems to be that there is, despite government pledges to crack down, there seems to be a constant flow of people coming into the country on small boats. Now, I'm going to say off the very top of this video, I do think there is a degree of hysteria being whipped up by the right wing press and by right wing politicians. That is my gut feeling. But I put the important caveat that I think the hard left are also naive on this issue. So I want to use this video to set the record straight on what my views are, because it's one of those things, it's a very partisan issue and it's very easy to misrepresent people's positions. If you look at a lot of the comments to the reports on this, it's a very tunnel vision way of thinking. It's an echo chamber. Anyone who thinks outside the box is immediately thumbed down. Now, I left a comment saying I think that any migrant guilty of crime should be deported. Even with putting that caveat, because I had also said it's wrong to vilify all migrants, I was thumbed down 87 times. I got like 20 likes. So a majority of people were thumbing me down. And it shows that there's just a lack of objective thinking on this from the right. It's like it's our way or it's a highway, agree with us 100%, or we're going to call you a naive lefty or a traitor or anything else that they come up with. Um, I find it frustrating and I think it's fanning flames. So I want to be very clear. I think that the hotels model is a big mistake. I've long been critical of that. I could see why it's bad optics. If you have people who are perhaps already struggling with the cost of living, and there is issues of crime in a particular area, and migrants are accused of that, and then people see them getting, living in a hotel and perhaps getting perks from that. One of the tabloids was publishing what various councils are giving to migrants. It will naturally breed anger. I mean, that's not rocket science. It's clear to see why that's happening. And I think that sometimes the left have been guilty of simply dismissing everyone who's concerned about the subject as far right or racist, and that's obviously ridiculous. People have legitimate concerns, but I would point out that the right are just as dogmatic and just as guilty as smearing people who don't agree with them. For instance, even with putting the caveat, if you don't agree with them 100%, then you're going to be dismissed as a leftist. I don't consider myself a leftist on this subject. I consider myself a realist. I don't think we can have an endless supply of people coming in. But I make no apology for pointing out that vilifying every migrant is inflammatory and wrong. I'm not going to apologize for saying that. And I'm not going to apologize for saying there is definitely right wing distortion going on. Robert Jenrick, the former Tory minister, is one of the most egregious examples of this. When he said that he feared for his daughters, you could argue that's just a legitimate concern from a father. But he's a politician, he knew what he was saying, and I do think he's inflaming hatred and contempt towards all male migrants. He's effectively saying they're all rapists. I mean, that's inflammatory. Apparently, the BBC's talk for the day, the person making that, it's a spiritual message, had to apologise. The BBC apologised to Jenrick because the person doing the talk of the day accused Jenrick of xenophobia. Well, what about free speech? The right are very hypocritical. They're always preaching about free speech, yet when it comes to the migrant issue, they seem to think only one viewpoint is allowed. Um, and to say that there's no far right involvement is just a disingenuous lie. It's known that Homeland, which is a spin off of Patriotic Alternative, have been stoking up disinformation online. I mean, the people who are protesting in Epping and elsewhere aren't just going out from no influence. It's not like they haven't been influenced in some way. I think some of that is what they're directly seeing. They're seeing migrants going in and out of the hotels. But I think a lot of it is also online disinformation. And we saw what happened with that. We saw last year when the riots spread across England, when lynch mobs were going across this country threatening to burn people alive as a direct result of disinformation in the wake of the Southport killings on Telegram and other sources. So, for the right to claim that there is no disinformation, that there's no far right involvement, it is a disingenuous lie. And I think it's a lie that needs to be challenged. That doesn't mean that everyone involved is far right, but to say that there's no far right involvement is absolute rubbish. It's clearly rubbish. So they're being very dishonest about that. Um, I think that any migrant who does is guilty of a serious crime. It's adding insult to injury. That's some way to pay the country that's giving you refuge. I think they absolutely should be deported. And I do think that the left has been very, very naive on the subject. I mean, those protesters who, for example, would try to stop a convicted rapist from being deported, I would say, what the hell's wrong with you? I mean, what about his victim? That's clearly ridiculous. But again, this inflammatory argument that all male migrants are rapists, it's dangerous, it's dehumanizing, and it's putting them at risk of mob violence. I think that there are examples of migrants committing crime, and that's despicable. It's a despicable way to pay the country that is giving you refuge. But I will not apologise for saying it's wrong to vilify all migrants. And simply by saying that, I can already hear right wing reactionary morons call me a leftist or act like I don't understand the contentions that people have. But what is wrong with being against crude generalizations? What is wrong with being against the dehumanization of an entire group? Well, I mean, what is wrong with that? That's surely an open minded and sensible position to take. Like I say, there's no objective thinking with the right on this issue. It's either you agree with them 100% or you're a liberal elite, you're a leftist, etc., etc., etc. Now, this issue about not all migrants being dangerous rapists, I personally known some migrants. In fact, recently, this week, I saw two young Iranian men being baptized as Christians. Why is this significant? It's significant because this is the sort of reason a lot of people are leaving the countries that they're coming from. If you are a Christian in Iran, there's a very high chance that your life is being threatened. So another distortion that's being spun is that all the migrants are Muslims. That is categorically not true. In fact, if they're from a country like Ethiopia, it's far more likely that they're Christians. Um, Ethiopia is a majority Christian country. If they're from Iran or Afghanistan, which are majority Muslim countries, there's a reasonable chance that they're either a Christian or they're a Muslim minority from a Muslim minority group like the Ahmadis, um, which has been a persecuted group in Pakistan. Um, so, again, there's a distortion that they're all Muslim migrants and they're coming here to spread Islamism. Well, some of the most egregious Islamist fanatics have been British citizens. Remember, we've just marked 20 years since the London bombings. Four jihadists who slaughtered people in London were from Leeds. They were British Pakistani men. They weren't migrants. So again, even the thing about Islamic extremism, very often it's British nationals who have far more extreme Islamist views than Muslims actually coming from those countries. That's an irony, in fact. Um, I do think the situation needs to be controlled. We cannot, it's just obvious that we cannot have an endless flow of people coming in. There does need to be deterrence. I do think that there needs to be tougher vetting. I think there's certain things that could be tried. But I will say something else, which I know won't be popular with everyone. But I think there needs to be another point of view as well. I think there's far, far too much negativity around migration in general, whether it be from migrants and small boats or just immigration in general, because right now it's not just talking about stopping the small boats. They want to really crack down on immigration in general, even legal migrants, even people who are coming here and contributing to this country, speaking English, people who have an affection for the UK, people who are contributing to the UK, Filipino nurses, Indian doctors. I've spoken before about this hysterical hostility to the idea of young Europeans um, getting education here, going to British universities. I don't understand. Why would anyone have a problem with a young Czech student, a German student, a French student um, coming to British universities? And why would they want to make that process harder? I just don't get it. So I do think there are people in this country who just have a generic hostility to outsiders. And I'm going to say I do think there's racist sentiments amongst some of the opposition to the migrant issue. Now, I think the right's being very manipulative about this because the left has traditionally thrown around the term racism, and they have been guilty of, banning everyone far right who wants to have the situation controlled. What the right are now doing is quite manipulative. What they're saying is there is no racism. There's no far right involvement. Now, this is not true. How would you describe someone who is literally going down a street in Middlesbrough, stopping vehicles and seeing what ethnicity the person inside is, if not racist? What would you call a mob in Ballymena targeting Filipinos because of something Romanians have been accused of? What would you call um, people who are absolutely enraged, threatening to burn human beings alive, getting drunk, throwing things at the police, a woman bringing her young son to one protest. So much for because again the right make this picture like it's just concerned families. Well, it sort of gives this implication that just because someone's a mother, she's not capable of being involved in a criminal offence. There's some so-called mothers out there who, in my view, are terrible role models. Just because someone's a mother doesn't mean she's going to be a role model citizen. And as for the lie that the migrant hotel protests recently have been wholly peaceful, we haven't seen the sort of level of violence, thankfully, that we saw last year or in Ballymena. But to say that it's wholly peaceful is a lie. Why would someone bring these sort of flares to protest if not to cause trouble? Why would they be vandalizing buildings? Why would they be throwing things at the police? Why would they be putting balaclavas on their face if not to cause trouble? And when that is cited, it's always, well, it's left wing provocateurs. Now, it's true that some hard left groups have also been involved, and I know that GB News had one of their reporters assaulted by one of these hard left activists. I condemn them as well. I condemn anyone using violence. But I'm sick and tired of the right distorting the situation and claiming that everyone is peaceful, or that there's no far right involvement, or that there's no racist component involved. I think there are legitimate concerns about the migrants, but look at the epidemic of shoplifting that we're having across this country. Shop theft, let's call it what it is. Um, most of that isn't being carried out by migrants. A lot of that is British nationals, and many of them are white. And I don't like race baiting, but it has to be pointed out that, I mean, in my city, quite frankly, I feel far more of a threat from young white teenagers than I would from any migrant. I'm being absolutely honest in that. If I see a group of young white guys, I honestly I tense up because the reality is in my city, they are far more likely to be involved in criminal antics than a migrant. That's just the reality in my city. That's not to vilify all young people, but it's just the reality. So I think that people like Robert Jenrick are playing a dangerous game here. They are vilifying all migrants, they're fanning the flames. Um, the situation in Epping is that the hotel has lost the case. There's High Court injunction to have the migrants moved elsewhere, and they say that's going to disrupt the life of those migrants. But quite frankly, the anger is rising. And I think that if they're concerned about the people in the hotel, surely the people in the hotel are at real physical risk. If they step outside, during those protests, I think there's a very real risk their safety would be compromised. And that's another thing. Um, we're hearing about why are the police at these protests? Why are the police being partisan? The police are there because if they weren't there, there's a very, very real chance that migrants would be physically attacked and maybe worse. So I'm sick and tired of the lie that this is entirely peaceful. Stop lying. It's not peaceful. Hand on heart, can you tell me if you are in one of these anti-migrant protests, that if you saw a migrant, you wouldn't, that you just simply remonstrate with them? No. I think what we have seen, the evidence is that there is a real risk to their safety. And then people might point out, well, they're also posing a risk if they're involved in criminality, if they're preying on young girls. My point to that would be arrest them, punish them, deport them, right? But do not tell me that the protests are entirely peaceful. It's a lie. So I feel that my stance on this is moderate and sensible. I want a control on illegal crossings, and I want a sensible approach to immigration in general. But I do think there's far, far too much negativity over the subject. Parties like the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and others, I disagree with them on many areas, but I don't think they're wrong to say that there's far too much negativity on the subject of immigration. It's a constant bombardment of migrants and immigrants are bad and they're a threat, and it's a fear of the other. And some of that has a basis if people aren't integrating, but some of the worst criminals out there are British nationals. So I feel far much more of a threat from young offenders, many of whom are British, than I do from migrants. And if you're a young woman, again, this idea that all migrant men are rapists disregards some of the predators in our own midst. You know, it's just a dangerous distortion. But I accept that my view might be in the minority because the right wing press are really stoking this thing up. If there is further violence, if we see migrants being, I don't want to say it, but if we see real violence, I think the right wing press will have a lot to answer for their distortion. It's not outright lies, but it's distortion. Actually, it is lies to say there's no far right involvement. GB News is a source that cannot be trusted on this. They're pushing an agenda. They've decided we're 100% on the side of the protesters. I mean, GB News may as well just be their media outlet. Because GB News has decided we're taking this particular ideological position, so we're going to vilify migrants on a daily basis. We're going to stoke up the anger. We're going to fan the flames. It's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. It's a lack of journalistic integrity. Um, I'm not talking about them being critical of migrants who commit crime. I'm talking about this orchestrated agenda to vilify all migrants. That's what GB News is doing, and it's a disgrace. And other outlets do that as well. The Daily Express, the Sun, the Daily Mail. There's absolutely no attempt at balance. Most I've seen from GB News, and I had to do a double take on this, was the other day they actually had a legal expert talking about the differences between the Connolly case and the Labour councillor who was inciting violence against the far right, and he was actually explaining why, in his view, the two cases were treated differently. And I had to do a double take. I thought, is that really from GB News? But to me, that's just them saying, okay, well, we're legally covered, we've showed a balance, but the overall agenda of GB News is basically, it's to show hostility to migrants, to vilify them. Um, GB News is never going to cover the things I've seen. For example, migrants getting baptized because it's too dangerous in Iran to do so. They're never going to do an interview with a migrant who had fled Afghanistan because he's been promoting girls' education and the Taliban had threatened his life. So GB News has failed to show the whole picture. That to me lacks journalistic integrity and they need to be called out for it. Um, right, so I'm going to wrap this up, but I do think there is an enormous amount of distortion going on with this issue, and I find that troubling. Um, I do not believe that everyone who's protesting is far right or racist. I think there's legitimate concerns, but I will not apologise for pointing out that you cannot blame migrants for all the crime in this country. B, um, it's wrong to vilify all migrants. And C, um, that because someone is taking a balanced approach doesn't mean they're naive about the situation. I mean, I am critical of the left when they think we should just have an end this open door policy. That is ridiculous. And it is ridiculous to call someone a racist for showing concerns about this issue. So I acknowledge that. But honestly, I'm tired of having to make that disclaimer because the political right, unless you agree with them 100%, then you're a liberal elite. It's really tiresome to hear that argument, but it's an absolute fact that there has been far right involvement. So when GB News insists that there hasn't, they're lying. They're actually lying. Um, I'll leave it there. But I think just, and in general, the way the immigration issue is treated, it's overwhelmingly negative. I'd like to hear a lot more positive. For example, about the contributions that immigrants make to this country, because they do. I'd like to hear a lot more positive things. Also, I think it's pretty callous to say, for instance, if you have a couple, maybe one partner is British and another is from another country, say, we need to put up barriers and make their life harder. I would say to people who take that position, you found your partner, you found your husband, your wife. What the hell gives you a right to deny someone else's happiness just because their partner happens to come from another country? I think the government should have a human understanding of those situations. And of course, people need to show that they're contributing to the country. I think having a reasonable level of English, no criminal record, etc. But I have a big problem with the constant negativity the right is churning out on a daily basis about this subject in general. I'd like to see more positivity around it. I'd like to see less vilification of migrants, and I'd like to see the whole picture, not just agendas being pushed by the right, and yeah, by the hard left as well, but predominantly by the right, has to be said. One last thing, I think Starmer's threat to deport people convicted of crimes is justified, but will it be enough to appease, the mob? I don't know. We'll see.